Hello and welcome to Arbors of Harbour for April. It is actually the afternoon right now, and I am racing that sunset. So here is my 7 books in the month, like that. I didn't even do a clap, just tossed them all up. So got one for every category again. It's kind of a pretty straightforward month. Everything this month has been kind of weird and sad and depressing, so I am sorry if that is the tone of this month. I will try to read something more happy next month, or at least get into the mood of something not about the darkness of the human soul. We'll try to do that. But anyways, this is this month, and this will be kind of depressing. I'm very sorry. Book one. This is The Reader by Bernhard Schlink. It is translated from the German, and it is a post-World War II novel from a German perspective. It's looking at the legacy of Nazism and how individuals in Germany rebuilding from that war engage with the history of World War II and the actions that Germany took in that era. And it's also a very individualized story. It follows a young boy who forms a romantic relationship with an older woman in his neighborhood, I guess. And as that boy grows up and starts to learn about the war crimes and starts to go to the Nuremberg trials, he realizes that the woman he was in a relationship with as a child is now on trial for war crimes. And the novel works on 2 levels. It works as a story of personal guilt and personal regrets, but also one of more symbolic nature, looking at the national guilt that Germans faced after the wake of World War II. It's okay. It's very fast. I think if I was just to look at this from like a formalist perspective, just to completely ignore all the themes and what it's trying to say, and just look at how the book is constructed, it's constructed very well. I think the actual sentencing, the actual phrasing is done really well, and the translation from the German is very clear and succinct as well. It's just easy to read. I finished this in 2 days, and every little moment is there for a good reason, and it has a mid-book plot twist that hits properly. Like, it's a good twist, and it works well. There's not really anything I can complain about in regards to the structure or the construction, and it's really worth studying. I would compare it to something like Disgrace by J.M. Coetzee, which is similarly short and to the point, able to communicate a sense of themes and concerns whilst also being nicely constructed and easy to read. That's the structure side of things, and that's all good. I think thematically, though, I have a lot of issues with the way that it depicts Nazism and war crimes, and I really kind of wonder what role this plays in the grand scheme of literature about World War II, because I think there is a potential, and I don't want to say like deliberate, I don't think this is what the author was trying to do, but there's the potential misread of this novel as a sort of apology for the moderate nature of some of the Nazis. I mean, the book is about the Nuremberg trial, so obviously that's a given, but it does feel like it's centralizing itself more to the side of the perpetrators, and it really muddies that type of dynamic and relationship between the perpetrators of the Holocaust and the victims of the Holocaust. I think, I mean, to me, it really reads like the national grappling with this history and trying to reconcile with it and understand it. And whilst I could say that it's really complicated, I could also say that honestly feels a little simplified. I don't know. I feel like I'm not smart enough to have a take on this or have a say on this. I I have read so many books about World War II this month, and I know nothing about this topic. I'm not very interested in war, but so much classic literature has been affected by the events in World War II. Slowly, I will learn more about it just from reading classics, I guess, and I'll come back to something like this and I'll be able to say more directly what I think of it. But that's just my initial view now, is that it's well written, but also thematically just a little bit worrying. I give it a 4 out of 5 still, because it's very quick, very easy to read, and for what it's worth, it's not punchy. Like, it doesn't shove its themes straight down your throat. It's just like, it raises these questions, and I think it's an opportunity to have a discussion, and yeah, I don't know, it's difficult. It's really difficult. I'm moving. Book number 2, this has been a long time coming. This is the Charlotte Bronte of this month, the novel Jane Eyre. This is a very old edition. This is from when I was, I think, 7 or 8 years old. I went to a bookstore and I got a copy of this, and as a kid, I probably read it, but I don't remember anything from it. Actually, the thing that made me want to read Jane Eyre again was I remember like little details from the opening of it, but knowing about the novel White SOC, which is about about the experiences of one of the characters from this novel from their perspective. I was really surprised because when I read about that synopsis of White SOC, I was like, I don't know that character. I don't remember reading about that character when I was reading Jane Eyre. And one of the core tropes of Jane Eyre, spoilers for a 200-year-old book, is the mad woman in the attic. And I remember reading this as a kid and thinking, there wasn't what mad woman in the attic. So clearly I didn't read it properly. And so I came back to it, and here is what I think. I think it's pretty good. Controversial opinion, Jane Eyre is pretty good. Out of all the classics that I've read, all the classics from the 1800s, I think this one is the most emblematic of novels. And I've always thought to myself, if you're someone who just reads Pride and Prejudice once a year or Jane Eyre once a year, and that's the only book you read that year, you're probably still a very good reader that is meaningful to you, if you are taking meaning and comfort and really anything out of it. Jane Eyre is probably one of the easier novels to read from the 18th century. The language is not as complex as some of the other things coming out of that era. The themes are a bit easier to gel with. The main character has values that are very similar to values of today, and I think structurally it's much better paced than most of the books from this era. A lot of the books from the Victorian era get hung up on little details, and they love to show the very basic, ordinary passage of time, whereas Jane Eyre is just event after event after event. It's very clear in every chapter what the significance of this event is and where it's going to take our heroine. It's just very easy to follow. And I read this amazingly quickly for how long it is. It's something like a 180,000 word book, and I read it in 4 days. It's very well plotted. It's really easy to get into. And if you're someone who hasn't read a lot of books from the 1800s, this is a great start. So I would give this a 4 out of 5. Number 3, something I know nothing about, but it is aquatic, is The Shipping News by E. Proulx. This was really interesting. So the premise of this novel is that a middle-aged man named Coyle, Quoyle, he is living a really sad and unfulfilling life in New York. And through a bunch of tragedies, the wife that he doesn't love very much passes away in an accident. And so he and his aunt and his 2 children pack their bags and go all the way to Newfoundland at the northern reaches of Canada, and they try to integrate with the society there. It's kind of like a pastoral novel in a sense, because the region of Newfoundland is where Coyle's family heritage is from, and it's a type of rediscovery, going to this wilderness or remote region and learning to live there, to be with the people there, to understand the different values of the people there, and just to enjoy life in this really unusual place after New York was a place that gave this narrator just a great deal of sadness. It's nice. It's decent. It's very everyday. It doesn't have a lot of... Well, it doesn't have a core narrative arc. It's really hard for me to describe what is the core narrative of this novel. Instead, it's just the events that get Coyle to Newfoundland, and then the various things that happen to him there. And most of those things happen to run around the same kinds of themes of wilderness and family and memory and regret and rebirth. And it works well. I think that the individual events, if you take the facts that you're not reading a romance, and you're not reading a murder mystery, and you're not reading anything tropey, you're not reading a book that has a clear through line to what the beginning, middle, and end is going to be like, then The Shipping News can be very enjoyable, because it's full of these little surprising details. You never know what's coming up next. You feel like you're entering this strange and unusual, but also kind of heartening space immediately, and you feel connected to these characters. You start to really understand these characters, and every little moment where Coyle feels more integrated with this town, you feel a bit more warm too. You feel that joy of meeting your community and meeting people who understand you. It's really kind of nice. The prose of this novel is really unique. The sentence structure is just... I could swear at least half of these sentences are not full sentences. They're just descriptions. And it leads to this empty and parched and abrasive feeling when you read it, because you don't get a narrator who is very verbose or very rich. Instead, you get a narrator that feels like they're just distant from you, that it feels like they want to give as few details as possible. And it's such a unique experience, probably one that's hard to get used to, but once you start reading a few chapters and you kind of know what the feeling is like, it's not too hard to follow. I did find quite a bit of difficulty reading it. I felt like I was reading very slowly, and every now and then I would go past a few pages and go, I have no idea what's happened, so I had to go back. It's not a smooth experience, and that challenge is also, I think, part of the experience. The challenge is there to mirror the emotional distance that the narrator or the protagonist also feels. That's what I would say anyway. So The Shipping News, very unique novel, quite interesting, about topics that I never really thought I would be interested in until I started this reading challenge. I would give it a 4 out of 5. I enjoyed it. Book number 4, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. This is my aesthetic cover because I just really love the font. I really love the Art Deco style, and every different version of this book also has a super aesthetic cover. I'll put some more on the screen right now. And also the title is very evocative. The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. I have no idea what this book is about. I've heard people talking about it. It is about two mute people living in, I think, New Orleans or somewhere in Louisiana, maybe an unknown city in Louisiana. It's about a big block of shared accommodation, and you've got people living there who are all in their various stages of personal tragedy. You've got a young girl named Mick who's trying to figure out her space in the world, but she comes from a very disadvantaged family. You've got what else have you got? You've got two other characters. You've got a drunkard who kind of goes wandering around and he doesn't really fit in with society, and you've got a black doctor who is a Marxist, but he's trying to find a way to communicate his values to the rest of his black community, despite the fact that he's coming from a irreligious perspective, and his family all kind of disagree with him because they think he's a bit too harsh and abrasive. We have these characters who would be really unable to communicate their beliefs and values to people around themselves, and they all find connection with this mute man who lives in this big complex. They all go to the mute man, his name is Mr. Singer. They all go to Mr. Singer and they explain their lives and they explain their values to him. And because he can't really respond, he's just sitting there and listening and nodding along. Each of the characters feels a form of fulfillment or a kind of self-actualization, that they're a little bit less lonely. They're a little bit more understood by someone else in the world. It's supposed to be heartening, but this book is just absolutely filled with tragedy. Every couple of chapters, just something awful happens. And the worst part is you just get used to it. You just start expecting bad things to happen to these characters. People get hurt. People say things they can't take back. People get imprisoned and treated harshly and unfairly. And it's just, there's so much cruelty in this book. These characters face terrible, awful circumstances. And the reader's kind of set apart from this. And we're watching this all play out and we go, we can't do anything. We don't have any hope for these characters. We don't think anything's going to work out. Even the three main characters we're talking to Mr. Singer, the ones who have these big and lofty dreams, each one of them has this dream of how they want to see the world reinvented. The young girl wants to be a famous singer. The drunkard wants to unite all the workers under a Marxist lens. And the doctor wants to see a black identity that looks out for each other and that gathers together. And all three of these characters just aren't able to achieve their idealistic visions. It's just a book about the lack of, the meaningless of hope, really. These characters are so hopeful, but they're surrounded by just these horrible events, and it's such a sad experience. But it's not a book where you cry. It's not a book where you feel the emotions of the characters. Instead, you, the reader, just feel helpless in general. And you become so much more aware of the different types of suffering in the world. You become more aware of how hard it is to communicate with other people. I give it a 3 out of 5. It made me very sad, and I don't know what to do with it. Book number 5. Catch-22. What a weird book. I So I know what a catch-22 is. I think that's the phrase that's entered our cultural lexicon very easily. A catch-22 is a paradoxical decision, kind of like a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. I know what that is, but if you were to ask me what the plot of Catch-22, the novel, is, I have no clue, and I wouldn't have been able to tell you before reading it. I knew vaguely that it was about World War II, it was about the American Air Force, about flying on missions, and I knew the first line was, it was love at first sight. That's all I knew about this novel. And having read that, I was very surprised. I was describing this to a coworker. I would describe this as Arrested Development, but set in World War II. The first, I would say maybe the first two-thirds or so, is just this bizarre screwball comedy following a pilot named Yossarian who tries to be dismissed from the Air Force because he's flown enough missions, but every time he's about to reach the limit, the amount of missions goes up. So first they say, oh, you've got to fly like 30 missions and then you're fine, right? Then you can be discharged and you'll be honorable. And he flies 28 missions and they go, okay, now it's 35 missions now. So he flies to 33 missions and go, oh, now it's 40 missions now. And it keeps going up and it keeps going up to the point where he realizes the absurdity of all of this and he decides to just do whatever it takes to not fly any more missions because he realizes that he's gonna die if he keeps flying these. Like the amount of chaos and mismanagement that comes from the war effort and the overall meaninglessness of all the missions that he flies. He doesn't really even know who he's bombing or why he's bombing them or what any of this has to do, but he does know his superiors have no idea what's going on either. So he's just trying his best to not be assigned to any combat missions. He's pretending to be ill or mentally unwell. He's convincing other soldiers to rise up against the superior officers. He's just doing anything in his power to not fly these missions, and it's not working very well. And the reason why it doesn't work is because the entire United States military in this novel is an absolute shambles. Nobody knows what they're doing. Everybody is pretending. All the soldiers have hilarious backstories where, because they were unable to succeed in their general lives outside of the war effort, all of their insecurities and their failings and their shortcomings are brought with them into their military roles, and it's just so funny. The way that different motifs come up as well is what reminds me of Arrested Development. You'll see little moments, like a character is naked in a tree in one chapter, and then 15 chapters later, that comes back, and it becomes a humorous moment in another character's story, and another character is eating a tomato, and then that comes back 30 chapters later, and it becomes a really humorous moment. The amount of interweaving details in this novel is really impressive. I genuinely don't know how Joseph Heller did it, how he made all of these admittedly stupid details and all of these characters, something like 20, 30 different characters, and smashed them all together and connected them all together, and it's not that difficult to follow. It's a little bit difficult, but because these characters are kind of like caricatures, because there's just jokes scattered throughout, it's very easy to read, and it's genuinely a very enjoyable experience. But then the book starts to get serious, and they start to also reveal the darker side of the war, which I think responsibly is worth doing. It does change the tone of the novel, and it does start feeling very different. And at this point too is where I think the problems in the novel start to arise. I felt this novel treated its female characters terribly, and I don't mean to say this as to critique this novel or anything. I just think that if you are reading this book in the 21st century, you feel kind of guilty, or you feel kind of wrong, because the women in the novel, they're just treated so dismissively. I don't know how to say it. It's just, morally, I feel a little bit bad just from engaging with it, from laughing at their expense. It just feels like the jokes are punching in the wrong direction. Maybe that's how I'd phrase it. So some of that then feeds into the more dramatic parts of the novel, and it just made it a bit harder for me to stomach overall. I also thought that the novel's relationship with truth is really interesting for the entirety of the novel, because all the events are so bizarre and exaggerated and unusual. You can't really tell what's real and what's not, and because they engage with ideas of madness and mania and hallucination as well, you genuinely don't know. You'll read 3 chapters and you go, wow, this is really outlandish. I wonder if that's a fantasy or one of that's reality. There's just no way of knowing. And if you're okay with that, that's what makes the experience of the novel a bit more enjoyable. I would give it a 4 out of 5. I think it comes together really well. Catch-22 is a good book. What a controversial statement. All right, book number 6 is A Canticle for Leibowitz. This is, it's like the third World War II novel this month. I need to branch out next month. So this is a post-apocalyptic novel. It's really reacting to the atomic bomb at the end of World War II. And it's a speculative story where there is all-out nuclear war midway through the 20th century, and the Earth is destroyed, and everything is reduced to ash, and yeah, it's just not good. And we are brought into this new society where people have decided to shun technology and instead retreat into kingdoms or small communities and reenact a kind of feudalistic period of humanity very similar to the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages in Europe in the 1300s or so. So we have characters who are very afraid of and resistant to technology, and in the first section of the novel we follow Brother Francis, who is a monk in the order of Leibowitz, which is this really weird religion built upon half of very old and traditional Catholicism using Latin in its services, and also the teachings of just a random engineer named Leibowitz, and he just happens to be the person from pre-nuclear fallout times that left a lot of documents, and so the Order is kind of tasked with figuring out the significance of these documents and also what this can teach humanity about its past and its future. It's really interesting because we get this pseudo-religious or pseudo-biblical text about the nature of nuclear weapons and the fact that humanity is kind of doomed to keep repeating this pattern where every intellectual development is coupled with a military conflict, eventually escalating to the point where society destroys itself and collapses. The novel is broken up into 3 parts. The first part is immediately after in this feudal state. Then we enter a part of Renaissance, so we have characters who are slowly starting to rediscover technology that was lost. It's really interesting because it parallels, I guess it would parallel how the Middle Ages saw ancient Greece and ancient Rome. They saw these big cities and these really organized societies, and the first moments of the Renaissance in the 1600s would certainly have wanted to mimic the earlier time. And in the same sense, the future Renaissance in this novel tries to mimic our time today, right? They tried to learn from Leibowitz, they tried to learn from the knowledges that were left behind, and so they reinvent a lot of things that we take for granted today. And then the novel jumps in time a third time to the far future where the consequences of that Renaissance are explored. It's a really messy novel. It is 3 short stories the author wrote that was taped together, but it is also at times comedic, at times tragic, at times really brutal, and at times completely irreverent. It's just a lot of things. It's a lot of things, and a lot of things happening at once, but it's not very fun. I thought that was the difficult part of it, is that this is one of the novels that was crossover between sci-fi and literary fiction in its day, published in 1959, when previously science fiction had been very pulpy, very just for entertainment, and this was one of the first novels that had that crossover appeal. It had literary authors looking at it and going, this is a interesting depiction of the human condition. Yeah, it's okay. It's fine. It's a 3 out of 5. I have not really that many things negative to say about it, but also it's not a very fun reading experience, it's a very challenging reading experience, and it does feel very dated. I think the developments of literature and culture after the atomic bomb era have built in a direction that's very different to where this one is currently. So yeah, it's a 3 out of 5. And last one for... Whoa, what was that? And last one for April, this is my published in 2023. It's The Great Reclamation by Rachel Heng. This is it's a generational epic chronicling the modernization of Singapore, but it's following a young boy named Ah Boon. When he's young, he's born into a fisherman's family, and so he's able to take the boat out, and he discovers a set of islands all to himself, which allows his family to become quite well off because the fishing grounds there are just so much more rich and fertile compared to the other places that they're familiar with. And so these islands start to take a spiritual significance for our protagonist, and he also starts a relationship with a young girl in the region whose parents are Chinese or Chinese revolutionaries. So the history of this era is that Singapore is being influenced by all these different factions. They have the English, here referred to as the Angmo, and they are the ones who previously had colonized Malaysia or then Malaya and Singapore. And the other side has the Chinese nationalists, or the Chinese socialists, communists that were coming down from China, and they were preaching this message of anti-Western influence. And so we have this little island country with people that are very rural and agrarian being caught up in these conflicts. And all I wanted from this novel was to have a young protagonist who grows up in all this turbulence, right? I wanted to see someone from an agrarian background get pulled straight through history and come out the other side of a fully industrialized and modernized Singapore. I thought that would be such an interesting novel to explore is the history of Singapore is just really fascinating. How quickly the modernization happened. It makes me wonder just how did that happen, but also how would people have felt going through that? And this novel does celebrate that or explore that part of history. The funny thing, though, is that I forgot that there's a war in this novel. I forgot that, again, World War II rears its ugly head, because in between the conflict between the communists and the Angmo, we've got the Japanese, who came down through the Pacific, and they did occupy Singapore for a few years during World War II. And that gives this novel a very depressing core. I think the trauma of World War II influences these characters in a way that I was not expecting, and it connects the dots of history. It connects the colonial view of Singapore, then to the imperialistic Japanese view of Singapore, then to the, to extent, communist Chinese view of Singapore, and then the democratic industrialist and modernist view of Singapore. All of this happens across about 400 pages, and as I read this, the whole time I was thinking, the amount of work that's gone into keeping all these threads together is incredible. You really feel how much work has gone into this to keep the scope clear and clean, to keep the number of characters low enough that you remember and feel for all of them, to keep the plot moving along at a fast pace as well. I think it so easily could have been bogged down into just historical detail to historical detail, but everything feels relevant, everything feels important. The personal narrative of the protagonist is so neatly interwoven to the history of Singapore that sometimes it feels too neat. Sometimes it feels a bit like Forrest Gumpy, right? It feels weird that the protagonist is just baked into every significant moment. But I think it's a good way of illustrating to audiences this part of history and to make it a little bit more clear what people went through in this time. I quite enjoyed it. I thought that everything worked well. It's one of those rare novels where it doesn't feel like a 5 out of 5, but I also can't find anything overtly wrong with it. I think the prose is really clean and clear, the characters are really well developed, the setting is so well done as well. The flow between myth and legend and fantasy up until very clear realism, that is beautiful. It's one of the things I love most about Southeast Asian literature, is the way that if you dig far back into the past, it just becomes myth and fantasy. That's just really, really well done here, and Rachel Heng has done an amazing job of just keeping everything together. If you're interested in Singapore, this is a good novel. I'd hesitate to call it a definitive novel. It feels like it's trying to be that, but I don't know, I just don't feel responsible saying that. And maybe that comes down to the neatness of everything, the fact that it tries to have its protagonist be a little bit of everything from Singapore. Maybe it just feels too neat. Maybe that's a problem with it. I don't know. That's what I would give it. So that is a 4 out of 5.